Today, the dry, sandy soil along the river takes its toll on oxen. Teams are tired and sweaty. Wheels sink 8 or 10 inches with each turn as teams slog up the river's edge, 16 miles since sunup. Breen resorts to the whip for the first time. At the junction of the North Platte and Beaver Creek in the high prairie, 5 days west of Fort Laramie, the wagon train lumbers south to lay over a day. It's the day before Independence Day, a good enough day as any to take time off trail driving. Ashley Sweeney in her novel, Answer Creek. Welcome to Delmarva today. I'm your host, Harold Wilson. The great Missouri-based trails, the Oregon, Mormon, and California, used in the westward expansion between 1829 and 1870, saw approximately 500,000 immigrants making the journey to the west beyond the Great Plains. Most of these pioneers have been forgotten today, except for perhaps one, the Donner Party. And the 87 members of this party would probably have been forgotten as well, except for the ordeal near Truckee Lake and Alder Creek in the high Sierras, and perhaps also because of the stories of cannibalism. My guest today is Ashley Sweeney, here to talk about her new book, Answer Creek. Ashley, welcome to Delmarva today.
Thank you so much for having me, Hal.
Ashley is the winner of the 2017 Nancy Pearl Book Award for her first novel, Eliza Waite. Answer Creek is her second novel. It is a historical novel. Nancy currently lives in the Pacific Northwest and in Tucson. But I want to add here, if you will excuse me, that her father is Jerry Sweeney, a familiar writer here on the Eastern Shore. He is one of the editors of the Delmarva Review, as well as a past president of the Eastern Shore Writers Association. Ashley, let me turn to you. Briefly give us the context of this journey that you depict in your book.
Yes, well, let's consider 1846 in the United States, Hal. The Oregon Trail had opened up in 1843, so it was early on for the westward expansion. The U.S. had a new president, James Polk, and he was wedded to the idea of manifest destiny, that the westward expansion was providential and a given right to all Americans. So if we think about that mindset, there became a frenzy of westering fever, they called it. And people of ordinary means would stop what they were doing, pack up a wagon, and join a train going west. It was a time of adventure and opportunity. with a wide open prairies ahead of them.
Well, in terms of your book, why did you choose to write about the Donner Party? There have been a number of books, articles, and films about the Donner Party. Why did of the 500,000 that made this trek from Missouri, why did you choose the Donner Party?
It was a challenge, Hal. I figured if I was going to be writing a Western story, I might as well take on the most iconic story of all, which is the Donner Party. And in that was the gravitas of bringing a new perspective to this journey. And that's why I am firm in my belief that the novel captures the humanity of the immigrants. It isn't a salacious story. It isn't a sensationalized story. It's about real people who did what they needed to do to survive. Now, I know that there's been, at last count, I think 343 books written about the Donner Party. So this would make 344. But there hasn't been a novel about the Donner Party recently, except for one paranormal novel that came out 2 years ago. So I felt like it was time for a fresh retelling of this story. And of course, at the time I was writing, and even at the time before the book was just published, I had no idea that we would be in the middle of a pandemic and sheltering in place. So this novel is really resonating with a lot of readers because the Donner Party was sheltered in place for 124 days in windowless huts at the edge of the eastern slopes of the Sierra Nevada mountains. And it really puts it into perspective about what our sheltering in place looks like when they had to subsist on book covers and shoe leather and tinged ends of hides, let alone when they resorted at the last moment to cannibalism.
What are your readers telling you? How are they relating their situation to what they're reading about in Answer Creek?
Well, I'm basically hearing that it puts it into perspective, but it's still a hard story to read. And even the best of reviewers have said they've had to put the novel down several times to really contemplate what that would have been like. I'm telling it in present tense, so the reader feels like they are there on the journey with Ada Weeks. And I might mention that Ada Weeks, the protagonist of Answer Creek, is the only fictional character on the Donner Party rolls.
Tell us a little bit about Ada Weeks and why you chose this this wonderful woman. And before you do, however, let me add my voice to those of your other readers. I thoroughly agree with them. You have such a power of description and a power of narrative in this book that one is exhausted along with these pioneers. As we read, we begin to feel the grit and the dirt and the smell and the difficulty. And this is before they ever got to Truckee Lake and began their difficulties. It was just what you have given us is just an amazing experience of what it must have been like on a normal day in this in this caravan of immigrants. Now, your character is Ada Weeks, and she I found to be a very, very interesting fictional character in the midst of this historical happening. Tell us a bit about Ada, how you came up with her, what you expected of her as you wrote, and how she captured you and took on a life of her own as you wrote this story.
That's a great question. When I was first drawn to the party, I thought I really need to have a strong female protagonist. She had to have enough agency to speak her own voice, but she also had to be a daughter or a wife or a sister or a servant of someone else traveling. And we have to take into consideration the role of women in the mid-19th century. And that was basically as a silent partner to the men on the journey. So I tried to conjure a character, and I was reminded of a junior high school friend of mine named Ann Thomas. And she became my muse for Ada. I contacted Anne. She lives in Chalfont, California, near Bishop, also in the Sierras. I visited her. We had long talks about it, and she became the model for my character, so that while I was writing, I could picture Anne, her stature, her demeanor, her outlook on life. She's a tough woman. And I thought, I'm going to take Anne's character and then imbue her with the thoughts and the values and the mores of the mid-19th century. There were many times, Hal, when I would call or email or text Anne to say, what would you do in this situation? So she really became my silent partner in writing the character. So Ada Weeks is 19. She's orphaned twice, first by her birth parents and then by her adoptive parents on the trail. And she joins the Patrick and Margaret Breen family as a type of a housekeeper slash nanny as the Breens are traveling west with their 7 children. So she's a very interesting character. She's not like any character I've ever read, and she certainly is not me, because I faced a very hard reality in the writing of this book, Hal, and that is that I would not have been tough enough to survive this journey. And if mortality doesn't strike you in the face every day, it certainly struck me in the writing of this book.
What was the role of women? You touched on that as kind of helpmates to the men who did the heavy work. But beyond that, what was the role of the women on this wagon train?
Well, they were cooking 3 meals a day, washing their clothes in the rivers, darning socks at night, rearing children, trying to educate them along the trail, whether that was by book learning or nature learning or a combination of the both. Then also taking care of men's needs, everything that a man would need along the trail. So they were hardworking and often haggard. Think about giving birth on the trail, or aging on the trail. It wasn't as if they were sitting in comfortable homes back in Illinois or Indiana or Missouri. They were full helpmates on the trail with a lot of responsibility and no voice. Now that's where Ada comes in, because I feel a great weight on my shoulders, Hal, to tell untold women's stories. And even though Ada is fictional and she's based on a friend of mine, she's really a composite of hundreds of thousands of pioneer women who traveled west. So when I was mining diaries and journals of women who traveled on the trail, I would take snippets from one journal and snippets from another diary, and I would help to conjure Ada's character about what was expected of her. And mostly what was expected of women at that time was to be silent.
I got, and you can tell me if I have not understood this well, but one of the subtleties I found in Ada Weeks was her fierce sense of independence and knowledge of her feminine worth, and at the same time, her ability to withhold this expression in many ways. So you have for me, you have created in her a real tension between her independence, desire for independence, and her independent action. She does act independently, but in terms of taking a leadership role and advancing opinion, she is very reticent.
Yes, she does talk to the other women on the train, and there is internal dialogue also in the story. And she's not one to say, "I told you so," when tragedy strikes. She's stoic, she accepts her lot, but she also is moving on toward the goal of making it to California at all costs. She's not going back to Noblesville, Indiana. She's an orphan. She doesn't have a husband or a brother or an uncle or even a son to care for her. So she realizes deep within herself that it's up to her to make it there. And I think that's that piece of grit about Ada that causes her to succeed. Now, you had mentioned earlier about the number of people on the trail, and in the Donner Party itself, of course, the numbers, some say anywhere between 86 and 91 people are considered to be part of that journey for different reasons. Some people left, 2 were Native American, 1 was Mexican. So there was different variations of how many people actually were in the Donner Party. But the interesting part is half of them perished and half of them survived. And many people have asked, what is it that caused those to perish and those to survive? And that's a very interesting question, because it's not just about the majority of the women survived because of body fat. That could be part of the scientific reason, but there was a psychological reason, and most of the women survived, in my opinion, because they had a strong sense of getting to where they needed to go and protecting those in their care. And those included many children, and many of the children did survive.
It was interesting in my reading about the Donner Party in preparation for our discussion that yeah, 48, the sense was that 48 people survived. And the majority of those, interestingly enough, were women, were children who were like over a certain age, and interestingly enough, men who traveled in families. That the bachelors fared the worst. Do you have a sense of, from your reading and your research, why that might be?
That was one of the most surprising elements of my 2 years of research. Here you have a cadre of young, strong, ambitious bachelors who are hired on as teamsters or drovers, and they have everything that you would need physically to survive. So my perspective is that once they ran up against the blizzard, and I might add that the Donner Party missed the window of opportunity to cross the Sierra Nevadas by only 1 day. They had left Independence, Missouri in mid-May, and they were running late on the trail. That's a whole nother story. So it's mid-October, late October, and they get to the eastern slope of the Sierra Nevadas, and they are marooned for what turns out to be the rest of the winter. And I feel like those bachelors gave up. They basically resigned themselves to the fact that they were not going to survive this. And it was one of the most surprising, as I say, elements of all of my research, and quite an interesting story.
Well, let me ask you to tell us a little bit about the sensational part of the story and what happened in the Sierra in that pass.
Well, from my research, the blizzard that stranded them in late October, by the time they had really, they were disoriented already, they were starving already, they were weak already. By the time they woke up from this blizzard, their cache of cattle meat was buried under 12 feet of snow, and they had no tools left to dig through the snow to get to it. Many people have questioned, why didn't they just find that cache that they had under there? But they couldn't. The fact is, they could never find it. So they began to boil the bones of the cattle that they had eaten the meat of. They began to boil the hides. They began to singe the hides and eat the singed skin. Then they were just having a watery gruel of a tiny bit of flour that they had left with water. And by the time the winter wore on is when they were eating their clothing and their blankets and their books. They were chewing on bark from the inside of their cabins. And the stories about cannibalism were definitely a last resort. The immigrants did not turn to cannibalism until the very end. And with one exception, no one was killed, Hal, for their flesh. This was dining off of the already deceased. In only one situation that's still controversial today about the last man left at the lake, named Louis Keseberg, it's speculated that he might have murdered the last 2 toddlers before he was rescued. But he denied it his whole life. Many people never talked about it again throughout their lives, or the children later in their lives would write out, their stories. But let's think of 19th century journalism too. I'm a former journalist, and sensationalism was what got everybody's attention. And so many, many, many of the stories about cannibalism were highly fictionalized.
How were the survivors received when they got to civilization, and the cannibal stories began to circulate?
The Donner Party was stigmatized, and they were marginalized, and it took many years for instance, the Reed family and the Breen family escaped the horrors intact as a family. And they went on to have successful lives in the San Francisco, California area. But at first, which is where the book ends, Ada is still, she has survivor guilt. And she retreats to the woods off of Answer Creek, and we can look into that name of Answer Creek on a lot of different levels. But it became the place where I could round out her character arc, I could give resolution to the story, and I could end with how the experience speaks through the ages to people who are still alive today. How much do we really listen to what our ancestors are teaching us and telling us? And that brought me to a wonderful discussion with my father, by the way. And he had recently told me that his grandmother, who he loved dearly, had been a chuck wagon cook in Colorado in 1900. And the bells started going off in my head, and I thought, I think there's another novel there.
Well, it sounds to me like there is, and it sounds, if you wanted it, you might have a very good partner to help you with the research, because of Jerry's fictionalized family history that he has written.
I am halfway through my third novel, though, which is set in 1905 rural Arizona. So that one will come to completion before I start on any new project.
Is that a historical novel as well?
Oh yes, they'll all be historical novels set in the West with strong female protagonists.
Well, Ashley,
protagonists.
Ashley, I hate to say that we're out of time. A half hour goes so fast when there is so much good material to talk about. And your book is certainly that. I have to say, I really loved it, and I highly recommend it. Thank you for your book and for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thanks to all of you for joining us as well. I'm your host, Harold Wilson.